Hey everybody, a video here today on a lost mound site in Detroit, Michigan, and a few other things. And this is by request. I had a message from a guy named Brian who lives in the area, a Red Wings fan, and it really got me to look into this site. I had just seen a few pics, and I thought it was pretty interesting, but what I found here, this is one of the more fascinating sites from ancient America that I've read about, and all this learning pretty much has come in the last 24 hours, and I was pretty fascinated. Pretty horrified. We're going to go down to Detroit, Michigan. Look at some truly lost history here. We are going down to one of the most important sites of ancient America. Not a trace left of it today. Here we are down on Google Earth, just off Jefferson Avenue up here. And in this exact area, a couple thousand years ago, there was a great earthen pyramid here. And it stretched over into this parking lot over here. Today, nothing remains, and this pyramid came out into this area. It was over 2 football fields long, but this is the site in the Delray neighborhood in Detroit where a massive earthen pyramid once stood, and it wasn't alone. And this is one area that is built right over the remains, more than likely, of many skeletons from this lost race, this Mound Builders group, or whatever you want to call it. I believe today still remains are right under the earth here. Now here is that area from overhead where this earthen pyramid once stood. It was right in the middle of the screen here, just off of Jefferson Avenue, and this is the Rouge River here. Now I will leave a few links below, but here is the map, and these were called the Spring Well Mound Group, and there was mounds spread up quite a ways up the river here, but here is that main mound in the area I showed you on Google Earth. But what I'm learning about ancient America, it wasn't white settlers who settled a lot of these towns in ancient America. There was an initial great earthen mound from the Mound Builders, and that was the initial structure in a lot of these towns. I've talked about St. Louis, Pittsburgh, here's Detroit, Michigan. Now here's an article written a few years ago, and I will leave the link below. It says, what is the oldest human man-made structure in Detroit? Many people would say it's the Charles Trowbridge residence, or possibly the James Smith log house. But couldn't you say it's the burial mound located on the grounds of the Detroit historic Fort Wayne? Human remains more than 1,000 years old were removed from the mound in the 1940s. But this earthwork of sand and topsoil may not fully be what it appears. And here is a look at the only remaining mound. This is called the Fort Wayne Mound, near the old Fort Wayne site. But this is actually 2 mounds that were bulldozed together, and it's the only trace of this ancient history left in this area today. It says the monument at Fort Wayne was not alone. Before the 19th century, it was only one of several burial mounds built on a large sand hill that used to lie just north of the confluence of the Detroit and the Rouge Rivers. The hill was about 300 yards wide, nearly 3/4 of a mile long, and rose 20 feet above the shore. The French called this area Belle Fontaine because of the abundant freshwater springs that gushed from the side of the hill. The British called it Spring Wells. The name was retained by the Americans when the area was incorporated as the Spring Wells Township in 1818. At least 3 burial mounds were built on the sand hill at Spring Wells. Farthest to the southwest was the Fort Wayne Mound. On the northeast end was the Copper Works Mound, so called because it was adjacent to a copper smelting operation. It says northwest of the Great Sand Hill was Carson's Mound, also called the Circular Mound. It says southwest of the Sand Hill was a mysterious circular enclosure called the Spring Wells Earthwork. Near the north bank of the Rouge River, about 1/2 mile from the shore of the Detroit River, was the Great Mound of River Rouge. Here's a diagram of a massive circular earthwork located where Detroit is located now today. very near the mound site. This is just southwest of the mound site, and I am assuming it's on this, what is called Zug Island here. I think that is where it is located today. Today, obviously, looking much different than it did a couple thousand years ago, when the circular earthwork with an opening out to the Detroit River, I believe perfectly aligned to south, and this is what it looked like. This is really lost history. This is 250 feet by 350 feet. And here, coming from the 1800s, this is the Great Mound at River Rouge in that neighborhood I showed you on Google Earth. This was all that was left of it in the 1800s. This had been dug into, and really treasure hunters or pottery hunters or people just digging here had greatly reduced the size of this mound from its original size. Originally, some reports had it 700 feet long. I mean, holy cheese and rice, that is one big earthen mound. Sorry, I had to use Orion's line there. Now, what became of this mound? Well, I told you at the beginning of this series that these sites were treated much differently in different areas of the country. Some were preserved. Some were preserved a little bit later on in history. Some were taken apart for industry and neighborhoods. And some were just taken apart. And I know some of you have been upset at the way these mounds were treated. Well, buckle up. Here we go. It says, when the French settled at Detroit, they noticed strange formations along the shore near the Rouge River that flows into the Detroit River. They are indicated on this 1763 map of the area. And the area I showed you on Google Earth, right here, and this is the French name for, I think, Sand Bluff. And they documented other mounds facing the river, and this is what Detroit looked like in 1763, just a few block neighborhood. It says here, the vast number of skeletons found within this mound is consistent with the practice of the Huron Feast of the Dead. The Huron Wyandot people would gather every 10 to 15 years, disinterring relatives who had died since the last festival, and bringing their bones, bundled in beaver furs, to a sacred communal burial site. And it seemed they used sand from the nearby river, and people got interred here, and this mound just got larger and larger and larger. And that is pretty amazing. Today, sadly, nothing left of it today. Now here is a map of early Detroit, plotted out with the name of the property owners, and there's some people named Chase who own this area that the big mound stood on. And what became of the big mound? Well, is this disturbing? Oh, I think it goes beyond that. It says, Elisha and Caroline Chase came to own the land beneath the Great Mound, which was comprised mostly of fine sand. They hired Augustus Bordeno and his son Louis to dig sand out of the mound and sell it on the docks at Detroit for 2.5 cents a barrel. In the process, they uncovered 1,300 skeletons, which they simply tossed into the Rouge River. 1,300 skeletons were tossed into the Rouge River, where they probably lay at the bottom still today. It says, when Detroit's economy boomed in the 1880s, the factories which began trickling into Delray in the 1860s were drastically altering the landscape. The Detroit International Exposition was held here between 1889 and 1894, an event for which the Great Mound was finally leveled. The Solvay Process Company purchased the exposition grounds in 1895, taking advantage of the salt deposits beneath Delray to manufacture sodium carbonate. The Detroit Edison Company built a power plant adjacent to the Solvay property in 1903, and in the process destroyed an old Native American land construction known as the Springwell Earthworks. Now here is a pic from 1903. Teams prepare to lay a foundation of a powerhouse for Detroit Edison. And this is when the Springwell Earthworks were probably finally taken out for good. That pic, is that a mound? Well, it is a mound. What is it made out of? It is made out of buffalo skulls. And there is no context for this pic. and I find that really strange and a little gruesome. Here is an artist depiction from about 300 years ago of the Huron tribe's Feast of the Dead. And it looks like they're carrying the skeletons on their back. Now here is sand, little bottles that was donated to Harvard University, and some skeleton and some artifacts were also donated from this site to Harvard University, where I guess they still remain today somewhere. Now here is an illustration of the Detroit International Exposition Grounds from the late 1880s, and this is when a lot of these mounds were finally destroyed. A little exaggerated, but that is a pic coming from that era. And going back to Google Earth, I think this is where that exposition in the late 1880s was held. And then down here, these were the mounds. This is where they were laid out on these sand hills. And this river has changed. The shoreline has changed, but I think this right here is the old Fort Wayne site right here. Now the Detroit site, that lost site, that's fascinating. I will leave some links below. Here are some mounds that were found near Grand Rapids, Michigan. And let's just read about some other mound sites and some really interesting finds that were made. Now here is some prehistoric art that was found on a farm near Cass City, Michigan. And I believe that is north of Detroit in what is called the thumb of Michigan. But this to me, when I looked at this, I said, well, I think that's Orion. And why do I say this? Number one, it's an archer. Some stars would match up in this pattern. In the really ancient people, when they described Orion, and if you look at Orion up in the sky, and if you're going to become involved in archaeoastronomy, and looking at the heavens, and looking at constellations, you should really go out at night and actually look at them. Because the one thing that you notice about Orion is the star representing the left foot is raised above the right one, and it looks like he is striding. And in depictions like this, when the left foot is raised above the right foot, that immediately to me says it's Orion. And even the ancients call him the striding god, or the striding hunter, in a lot of ancient texts. And the archer, well, let's take a look at something here. Now here is a star chart of Orion, and what the ancient people knew is they knew how the stars moved. And here you can see why ancient cultures used Orion as the archer, because it looks like he's pulling the bow back, and the ancients knew this. And you notice here, the star representing the left foot is raised, so that's why I think this depicts Orion. Left foot raised, the archer. Now, one thing I found very interesting is what the tribes, the more recent tribes, had to say in this area about the mound builders. It says here, in a 1956 news article, amateur archaeologist Claire Reynolds told of an elderly Indian who refused to guide him to one of the ancient mound sites, warning, "It is not good that you go to the place of Yam Kodesh." The Indian insisted that the ghosts of the Yam Kodesh, the Ottawa name for the mound builders, meaning the prairie people, they still roamed the site. So these people were fearful of the spirits of these mound builders, and they certainly weren't going to mess with these mounds, because they thought doom and bad things would come their way, and they were actually fearful. It's now written 70 years ago. It says, some archaeologists believe, based on uncovered artifacts, that the mound builders had entered the Bronze Age, had a high level of intelligence, and traded with the Aztecs and the Mayans. It says, in 1925, University of Michigan professor Dr. W.B. Hinsdale surveyed the Lower Peninsula and listed Michigan mounds by county. 7 county had more than 20 mounds. There were 57 mounds in Clinton County. Macomb had 25. Wayne 12. Oakland only had 2, and those were at least the ones he found. He said there are fully 600 mounds still to be seen, and at least 500 more have been totally destroyed within the last 150 years. And he's writing this in 1925. The enclosures, usually known as Indian forts, but probably having no connection with military usage, are also vanishing rapidly. It is a duty of the state to locate, measure, photograph, and chart these structures before they disappear entirely. And there were other earthworks in the Thumb area of Michigan. It says, 1. The Great Mound on the Rouge in Delray at the junction of the Rouge and Detroit rivers captured the fancy of early historians. It was 400 feet long and 200 feet wide and 40 feet high, and that was by that time because it had gotten reduced by early people that were here. The French were documenting this place 300 years ago, and there was people going through it back then. But it says it was so packed with bones that they were easily exposed by wandering cattle. And when this grand mound was raised, it was just leveled. It doesn't seem any excavations went on into the ground. There was some just brief excavations made of a few of these skeletons, but most of them were just hauled out of there, tossed in the Rouge River. One of the more interesting finds by this professor at the University of Michigan is this skull right here. He suggests that they were doing ancient brain surgery, maybe 2, 3, 4, however old this skull is put in these mounds, and we really don't know for sure how old these mounds actually are, but they seem to be of a prehistoric race, different, much different than the natives living in this area. Now, I have tons of questions here. Why was this perfect circular hole drilled in the back of the skull? What instrument could you use to do that back a few thousand years ago in Michigan? What purpose was this? Were they actually doing brain surgery? Did this have some sort of ritualistic purpose? What area exactly of the brain are they getting into? Is this by the stem, the brain stem? Any medical anatomy experts out there could tell me how this could be done a few thousand years ago? Ritualistic purpose? Were they actually doing surgery? I don't know, but I find that one of the most fascinating finds coming from ancient America. Now here are some copper beads that were found at the site, and copper was found throughout. There was copper chest plate put over the leaders that were buried in here, the assumed leaders. There was also well-made, perfect copper kettles that were found. Seems these people were the ones that were taking the copper out of northern Michigan. They're the most likely candidates. Here is a look at the area today that the Great Mound covered. But here is a look. Here is where that Great Mound would have been. And here is the Rouge River today. And I found this fascinating. There was a woman buried in one of these mounds up the river that had shells from the Carolinas or Florida or somewhere along the southeast coast. All the way from there. These skeletons seem to be of great stature. Were they giants? No, but they seem to be a very large people. And this tribe that came here every 10 or 15 years to bury their dead in this great mound, what they used to do is after they buried their dead in the great mound, they used to go wade out into the river because they didn't want the spirits of the mound builders to go after them, and spirits cannot cross the water. So they used to walk out here in a zigzag pattern to avoid the spirits of the original builders of these structures. And then what happened to the people that they interred? Well, people who own this land threw 1,300 skeletons into the Rouge River. I just find that just unthinkable. In concluding, it says, by the 1920s, the Delray area was fully developed and no trace of the Great Mound was left. However, a writer for the Detroit Free Press pointed out that the actual site of the mound itself has not been built up, but remains a bare spot covered with buckthorn and other noxious weeds, and used occasionally by cheap shows and carnivals. After nearly another century of industrialization, the area is barely fit for human habitation. Across the former site of the Great Mound, on the other side of the Rouge River, lie enormous piles of coal and coke. And what is coke? That is a byproduct of making petroleum. It's a sand, and it's pretty nasty stuff if you look into it. And it says, as if intentionally mocking the ancient monument's absence. Adjacent to the piles of coke is a noxious steel mill, and a few blocks away lies the city's sewerage treatment plant. An oil refinery lies just beyond that. And of course, the entire area is surrounded by the thousands of vacant lots and decaying century-old cottages left behind by people who could no longer stand to live in one of the most polluted neighborhoods in the United States. It is as if we needed to wipe away every last trace of the old civilization in order to make room for the near and inevitable fall of our own. Tribes made pilgrimages here to bury their sacred dead. They waded in this river to avoid the spirits of the mound builders or whoever built these original structures. They didn't want to mess with them. They thought they would be cursed. And this is Delray today. That is about enough of the history of this place that I can take. Detroit is the birthplace of my grandfather. This is the site of a sacred ancient mound. I have not mentioned this in the video, but I have a tiny bit of Native American blood in my family from my grandmother's side. She lived in Cleveland, Ohio. Hope you thought that was interesting, and you all have a very nice day.